All right, so welcome everyone to our webinar, Turning TNFD Data into Decisions. My name is Megan Pillsbury. I'm the founder and CEO of Dunya Analytics, and I'm just here to facilitate for our two speakers today, who are my colleague, Rebecca Stern, who's our Chief Science Officer here at Dunya Analytics, and Joanna Karlic, who is the Partnerships Lead at the IBAT Alliance. We will have about 45 minutes of presentation followed by Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A functionality. You can submit them throughout the presentation and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. And we will also share a recording of this webinar after the session. So before we kick off, I would like to quickly introduce Dunya Analytics. We deliver on-demand nature risk intelligence for global enterprises, providing location-based ecosystem assessments of any business operation anywhere in the world in seconds. Powered by authoritative data from partners including IBAT and winner of the TNFD Grand Challenge, we make nature assessments affordable, accessible, and actionable. If you want to learn more, please reply to our webinar follow-up email. Joanna, would you kindly tell us about the IBAT Alliance?
Yeah, of course. So IBAT is the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. So we provide a tool and access to data sets. We're going to talk about the data sets in detail throughout the webinar, so I won't go into them now. But as you said, IBAT is also an alliance, so a collaboration between four conservation organizations. So these are some of the most highly credible and trusted organizations in the sphere of biodiversity. And through them, we bring these data sets that we're going to dive into throughout today. So the alliance partners are listed there on this slide. You can see them there. So the IBAT Alliance and through its partners, we are first and foremost mission-driven around biodiversity and protecting nature. But we also provide commercial access to data and tools that allow companies and commercial organizations to take action for nature. So we really believe that providing this data to organizations will result in positive results for nature. I want to stress that we are mission-driven, but we're also very much science-driven. So science is at the core of what these alliance partner organizations do, and this really translates into our data and tools. Furthermore, the data we collect follows very strict governance processes, and that really ensures accuracy, comprehensiveness, and really trustworthiness of the data. And this is why the likes of TNFD, CSRD, GRI, and other frameworks, this is why they recommend the use of IBAT data for biodiversity reporting. And finally, IBAT is a really critical cost recovery mechanism. So all the fees that we charge for accessing IBAT data, whether directly or through our collaborators, such as Dunya Analytics, all that money is reinvested fully back into the data sets. And this is really important because that really helps us ensure that the data sets continue to be maintained, but also to be expanded, that quality and credibility remains, and that we can continue to improve these data sets going forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Megan and Joanna. Here's our agenda for today. We just did our introductions. Do a brief overview of the TNFD locate phase, talk about what nature risk is, and then we're going to dive into the different sensitive location categories, biodiversity importance, ecosystem integrity, and community presence. And as Joanna mentioned, that's where we'll also dive into the IBAT data sets. Then I'll do a brief demo of the Dunya Analytics platform and show how we've integrated IBAT data into the platform. At the end, we'll have time for Q&A, but also please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A, and we may be able to pull those in along the way as well. So the TNFD framework, many of you are probably very familiar with, and of course it's a framework to help with disclosure and reporting. But the actual goal isn't just reporting, of course, but to align financial outcomes with environmental outcomes. All companies have hidden nature risks, and they're actually easier to assess than you think. And by uncovering those risks, you create a more resilient business. And this is why we're here today, to connect location-based data with business risk to illustrate how assessing those can help create a more resilient business. So the TNFD's LEAP approach is here, starting with locate your company's interface with nature. Of course, the focus of this webinar, evaluating your impacts and dependencies your company's having on that nature, assessing how your location-based results plus what you're doing at the site with your company link to risks and opportunities, and then preparing to build your nature strategy to take action and also to disclose. So the locate phase has 4 different sections or subsections. The first one being, what are our organization's operations and activities? The second, which of these activities are associated with our company's dependencies and impacts on nature? The third is, where are our activities with dependencies and impacts located? And finally, which activities are in ecologically sensitive locations? And this is the part we're focusing on today, identifying those sensitive locations and connecting them to different types of risks. So how does the TNFD define a sensitive location? There are 4 areas: biodiversity importance, ecosystem integrity, community importance, or in other words, ecosystem delivery, ecosystem service delivery importance, and water physical risk. We're not focusing on water today, just in the interest of time, so we're going to focus on the other 3. And then within biodiversity importance, there are a number of criteria: protected and conserved areas, areas scientifically recognized for importance for biodiversity, areas important for species, as well as areas with important ecosystems and those with ecological connectivity. Today, our focus is on global data sets. And for those last 2 that I just mentioned that are in gray, important ecosystems and areas important for ecological connectivity, global data sets on these, full global data sets don't exist. So those can only be evaluated on a local or regional level. So we're not focusing on them today. We're going to go through these different criteria in a few minutes, talk about the best available global data sets to conduct a screening level assessment, and then link those to business risks. So there are a lot of criteria here. Joanna, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why it's important to assess so many different categories for locate. Like, why not just choose one?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's a number of things. So, I mean, first and foremost, nature is complex. So there are many facets to nature, right? It's a lot more complicating than measuring greenhouse gas emissions, which we can kind of distill to one metric of carbon dioxide equivalent. We don't really have that for nature. So within nature, we have, your biotic and abiotic factors. We need to look at ecosystem health, biodiversity, where we kind of focus on species. We've got that connectivity, corridors aspect, ecosystem services, water, and things you mentioned. Also, pressures acting on all these components. And all these factors work together really to enable nature to thrive. So hence, we need to pay attention to all these components to understand our impact on nature and then our potential risks of harm. And then additionally, kind of from a company perspective, in terms of understanding our risk, each of these categories really uncovers a different dimension related to your internal risks within your company. So if you just assess one, you may miss out on risks that emerge from some of the others. And we want to ensure that there aren't any hidden risks that you're not aware of. And I want to acknowledge it is complex. So there are, lots of things here. And we know that many companies might not have the deep expertise needed to really understand in detail all these topics. But this is where, frameworks like TNFD are really helpful, because they really help guide you in terms of what you should be doing. And then also, of course, platforms like Dunya Analytics, IBAT as well, we try and make all of this easier for companies.
Yes, definitely. That is our mission. Yeah, so we were very interested in this question to see how companies are actually assessing the locate phase at this point. So last year, we at Dunya Analytics created a report. We looked at 50 different corporate sustainability reports to see, like, when they do the locate phase, what data sets are they using? Are they assessing all of the sensitive location categories? And we found that most companies are not assessing all 4. You can see in this last bar there, only 22% assessed all 4 areas of sensitive location. So understandably, these were the first TNFD reports for many companies. These were early adopters. So it's a great start. but it can, as you mentioned, Joanna, like leave some hidden risks if you don't assess all of the categories. So that's one reason why the TNFD describes all the different aspects of sensitive location. If you want to read this report, we've added it to the webinar, so you can access it here, or it's on our website, or of course, feel free to reach out afterwards. So where do nature risks stem from? So they're based on the combination of sensitive locations, which we just talked about, and we'll get into more, and also the material impacts and dependencies that your company has on those areas. Impacts are the way that your company affects nature, such as polluting into a waterway, and dependencies are the ways in which your company depends on natural resources. So for example, if you use water in manufacturing, you're dependent on a reliable water supply. And your impacts are going to be more material in a biodiversity sensitive area than in one that's less sensitive, which is why we do that sensitivity, why the sensitivity is part of the location analysis. And then what are the types of nature related risks? There are three main categories: physical, transition, and systemic. For systemic risks, the guidance is still evolving on how to connect that to the individual company level. Of course, physical and transition risks feed into systemic risks, but we're going to focus on the other two. Physical risks emerge from a company's dependencies. So the ways in which nature degradation or nature loss can actually cause harm to the company in terms of infrastructure, its assets, or economic activities. Transition risks emerge from a company's impacts. These arise as the economy, regulation, technology, markets, and society start to shift towards protecting and restoring nature. And then they occur when a company's business model or operations or supply chain are not aligned with that transition. There are a number of categories of transition risks, and these can sometimes be a little bit harder to grasp. Joanna, could you break those down for us a bit more?
Yeah, for sure. And just wanted to add as well, another way to think of transition risk is really kind of posing that question there is, what could financially hurt my business because the world is changing to become more nature positive? And these changes might come from perhaps governments, what investors are looking at, what consumers want, maybe technology, public opinion, so a number of different factors. But in terms of the kind of subtypes of transition risk, so there are five that TNFD have kind of defined. So we'll go through those. So policy risk really comes from new policies, laws, regulations, and so on that are coming in that are associated with either creating positive impacts on nature or that are aiming to mitigate negative impacts on nature. So these are kind of new things that are coming through, which kind of strengthening this idea of protecting nature kind of through that policy lens. It might also be stronger enforcement of existing policies. Reputational risk, I think most people are pretty comfortable with this one, but essentially this is kind of changes in perception of whether it's consumers, maybe local communities, wider society on what you as a company are doing in terms of your impact on nature. And this could very much be kind of your actual impacts on nature, or even the perception that people have of how you're affecting nature. And this risk can stem from what you yourself are doing as a company, but it might also come from your value chain, so upstream and downstream. So that's really important to pay attention to as well. Liability risks are very much risks that come directly or indirectly from legal claims. So either being fined for doing something that's illegal or being sued as well in that realm. Market, I'm going to just touch on market and technology quickly. So your market risk is kind of changing dynamics in generally consumer preferences and kind of what's in demand in the market and through this transition phase. And the technology risks are new product services that are coming out that maybe through this new technology have a reduced impact on nature, and you therefore need to start adopting those new technologies. Now, we're going to focus today just on the first three because these are the ones that are connected to the locate phase. The market and technology risks are really more connected to other business decisions such as product design. So we're not going to cover that here today, but obviously all still really important. And just as we were preparing for this webinar, I was thinking about like the policy versus the liability risk, because to me, sometimes it's hard to distinguish exactly like the difference between, because there is a lot of overlap there. And so just to touch on that, like policy changes will often create or increase liability exposure. So liability risk, often you can think that this is policy risk that has crystallized into legal accountability, but noting that liability can also arise without new policy. It might be things that were, been illegal for a long time. So so I think we're going to then move on. So I'll pass back to you, Rebecca, to talk about can you tell us about how do the different aspects of sensitive locations connect to nature risk, and why should they matter to business?
Yeah, definitely. Yep, great. So yeah, we can dive in now to the different aspects of sensitive locations. We're going to start with community presence. At Dunya and on our platform at Dunya Analytics, we center community presence in our results on the platform, because humans are really dependent on nature, and certain communities are highly dependent on nature. And we think that is central to biodiversity assessment, as the TNFD also describes. So on our platform, we look at two different aspects of community presence. First, are there indigenous or community lands near to your business location? And then we look at areas that provide a really large contribution, like in terms of nature's contribution to people, meaning we look at the top places across the globe where the most number of ecosystem services are provided for the greatest number of people. And of course, indigenous and community lands also, they overlap with some of the most biodiversity rich areas on the planet, and they're also more intact than other areas because of the way that they steward the land and the ongoing relationship with the land. Two examples or two main risks that often come up with community presence are liability and reputational risks. So liability risk in terms of failing to obtain free, prior, and informed consent, lands rights violations, complicity and displacement, or even polluting into an environment that is held or that is very important to indigenous or local communities. And reputational risk, of course, is very high here because land conflicts generate significant media and NGO attention, which is one example risk that I have here that was both liability and reputational risk. So this company, Vedanta Resources, they are mining, and they receive government clearance to mine in this part of India that's very biodiverse, is also the sacred homeland of indigenous peoples. But this area doesn't have any formal protection, although it is very important for both biodiversity and communities. But those clearances were permanently revoked. And that's because of two reasons. I'm going to go down. I have the risks and then the mechanism, but I'll go to the mechanism first. So they didn't get free, prior, and informed consent before they started working there, and they were found to violate that and a lot of other environmental regulations. And this triggered the legal loss of their clearances. And so they lost access to this bauxite deposit that they had already received permission to develop, and it drew international attention. And it actually triggered divestment by some of their institutional investors. So that's an example of how community presence can link to some of these transition risks. I'm going to pass it to Joanna. Can you start telling us about some of the categories of biodiversity importance?
Yeah, definitely. So So the first one we have is on protected and conserved areas, and we provide this through one of the IBAT data sets, which is the World Database on Protected and Conserved Areas. So a lot of these are quite a mouthful to say. So these are areas that are managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature. So these are places like national parks, state parks, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, maybe Ramsar wetlands and places like that. So this data set is put together by the Protected Planet team that are part of UNEP WCMC, which is one of our alliance partners. And this is, they collate this data from national and subnational governments, NGOs, and other groups. And as I mentioned at the start, it really undergoes rigorous kind of quality checks, governance processes, and scrutiny to ensure the data is accurate. But this is our one kind of globally collective data set that tells us where all these protected and conserved areas are around the world. It's a really, really important data set because it's actually one of the headline indicators for the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Target 3, which what we call kind of the 30 by 30 target, which says that we as a global community have committed to conserving 30% of land, water, and seas by 2030. So meaning we will set aside 30% of areas for nature to thrive in. And the way we measure that 30%, how far along are we towards that target, is through this data set that's curated by the Protected Planet team. So it's really important data set. In terms of how companies can use this and how this links to your risk. So main ones here are your kind of policy and liability risk. So this is when you're choosing sites for whether new operations or maybe if you're kind of acquiring existing sites. You really need to understand where you are in proximity to protected areas, whether you're within protected areas or maybe near, because in some protected areas, some commercial operations are completely forbidden, and others there might be some rules where you can, but you really have to understand what you're permitted to do. And it's near these areas where regulatory scrutiny is really often highest. We've also, reputational risk also plays in here, of course, because any negative impact on a protected area, national park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site will obviously not be perceived well by the general public, as well as, your regulators and so on. We also have this point around kind of maintaining social license to operate. So this is another, I see it still as a reputational risk, but whereas reputational risk manifests more at a global level, so they really affect your wider brand perception. Social license to operate really relates to your company's relationship with the local community. And that's really important because that local community they often form your workforce, they often form a core part of your supply chain. So having that positive relationship with the local people on the ground is really important to having smooth operations. So ensuring that you have that, respect for that community is really important. And this is where, really respecting places of value to the local community, which are often these protected and conserved areas, is really important. So if we then move on to our key biodiversity areas, so the next slide. So this is the other component of biodiversity importance, or another component. So scientifically recognized areas, which we have through the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. This is created by the KBA Secretariat through BirdLife International. And these are sites that are critical for the preservation of life on Earth, and that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. Now, only about half of KBAs are fully protected and the rest aren't. And actually that 30 by 30 target also includes kind of a sub-goal of protecting all KBAs. All KBAs should be protected. So that's, again, kind of one of our objectives as a global community. Now, what are these sites? So these to be classed as a KBA, the location needs to meet very rigorous criteria set by IUCN. So these are sites that might be, there's a number of different factors. So some examples are sites perhaps that are really important for critically endangered species, or maybe species that are geographically restricted So which means that those species are completely reliant on that habitat in that site. And if that was destroyed, then the species could potentially go extinct. We also have some KBAs, are KBAs specifically because they support biological processes for species, so such as breeding or feeding, and perhaps that might be year round, but it might be also at certain times of year. So understanding kind of those processes that are taking place there is really important, again, for protecting biodiversity. And then also another category are sites that are unspoiled and completely untouched or otherwise classed as irreplaceable. So this is what KBAs are. In terms of our list linked to risk, obviously that reputational risks is there because, as I mentioned, sites that are unspoiled, they become spoiled. That's obviously going to have impact on the reputation of whoever had that impact. But another thing to note is that emerging policy risks. So as I said, the aim as a global community is to protect KBAs. So if a place that is a KBA now is not legally protected now, it very well might be in the future. So you've got that emerging policy risk coming up that might then become your liability risk once those protected areas become legally protected. So I think we can move on to the next slide then. And I just wanted to talk about so using this information around sites of biodiversity importance around protected areas and KBAs, what should you do and how should you manage risks and potentially also realize opportunities when you realize you're maybe near these sites? So firstly, early screening for risk is really key. Avoidance is always less costly when put in place early rather than trying to retrofit after the fact once a project is already live and operating. So doing that early screening, understanding where my proximity to these areas is, can really help you avoid regulatory hurdles, permitting delays, can help you secure access to financing. So showing that you've done your thorough due diligence on locations ahead of new projects can really help all those things. Now, in terms of then how do you manage that risk? So we know that a lot of organizations now are applying the mitigation hierarchy. And one of the things you can, again, kind of just going deeper on that, a lot of organizations are starting to apply maybe no-go areas. So for example, selecting sites like UNESCO World Heritage Sites or Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, which are a subset of KBAs, those might be within our biodiversity policy, always a no-go. We would never develop those areas. And we've got organizations like ICMM, so the International Council on Mining and Metals, also our financial institutions who may be Equator Principles signatories, they apply this approach. And then in terms of KBAs, so IUCN suggests that there are some activities that should always be avoided in KBAs. So for example, damaging industrial activities that result in the loss of primary forest, and all palm oil plantations should not be taking place in KBAs. And then finally, there are opportunities as well that we can leverage once we understand this, that we might be kind of in or near these areas. We could very well prioritize KBAs as a target for some of our corporate social responsibility initiatives or philanthropic donations. We might select these as priority sites for restoration. And then in terms of protected areas, we've got an opportunity to support the expansion of protected areas and OECMs to help contribute to that 30 by 30 target. And there's a number of ways that companies can do that, whether through financial, technological support, and so on. I think I will pass back to you then, Rebecca. I know you've got a good example.
I have an example. Yeah. So just reflecting as you're talking that if you do an assessment and you see you're near a protected area that they also or a key biodiversity area, that it's really, there are many opportunities there, and you can get to know more about that protected area or that KBA and see what the specifications are, and then link what your business activities are there and see if there's any synergies in terms of opportunities. So yeah, because they each have, one thing I've learned in learning a lot about the protected or conserved areas and KBAs is how each one is designated that way for a specific reason. And that's very location specific. So yeah, learning about those can provide some great opportunities. Yeah, I had an example risk for protected and conserved areas linked to palm oil, as you mentioned. So this company, AAK, is a Swedish oils and fats firm, and some investigative reporting uncovered that many of the mills that where they got their palm oil supply from had extracted oil from palm fruit that was grown illegally within a national park in Indonesia. And this park specifically prohibits land clearance and deforestation. And this report said that the company knowingly poached from these mills. So this was ended up being a huge reputational risk. Their share price dropped 5.5% within 24 hours after these reports came out. And so violations of protected area boundaries can carry both legal weight and heightened public visibility. So yeah, so that's one example with palm oil. I know the next category of sensitive location is areas important for species. Joanna, do you want to tell us about that next?
Yeah, definitely. So this is where then another IBAT data set comes in. So this is the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, and people might be somewhat familiar with this. It's quite a well-known data set, but essentially this is the world's most comprehensive information source on global extinction risk. So this, it's essentially a set of entries for species. We have about 170,000 species in the red list. And for each species, we have information on the conservation status of that species. So this will include things like the species' geographical range, the species' ecological requirements and habitats. What are the threats acting on that species that might cause it to go extinct or that are already causing it to become threatened? So these might be things like deforestation, hunting, pollution, might be climate change. There's a whole kind of taxonomy of threats that are included. And then importantly, also the conservation actions needed to reduce the threats. So what is basically needed to help protect that species, what conservation actions are in place already and maybe having some impact, but also what isn't happening and should be. So those can be really important points in terms of, well, we'll get to kind of the opportunities, but that's something you can look at. So essentially within the red list, you've got your kind of threat categories. So the ones people might be familiar with are things like ones like critically endangered, vulnerable. And those three are kind of our threatened categories, and those are usually the priorities for action. And then we have also near threatened, least concern, and others, which also should be considered as well. Just on I meant kind of mentioning the quality, the comprehensiveness, the governance behind these data sets. So here, each red list entry before it becomes an entry in the red list follows a really strict assessment criteria and is peer reviewed. So actually each red list entry for every species is a peer reviewed study. So it's kind of the best data that we have on these species. In terms of the links to risks, so again, we've got policy risks. So as stricter rules are coming in to protect species, something to pay attention to. Our liability risks are always there. Pretty much most places in the world have some sort of laws around what you can and can't do when there are species present. So ensuring that you know what species are there and what those liability risks might be. And then we've talked about reputational risks already. If anything associated with causing a species to either become threatened or cause extinct is obviously a huge reputational risk. One thing, sorry, I didn't mention the STAR metric, which I won't dive into in detail, but STAR is the species threat abatement and restoration metric. I want to flag that because I know you'll be demoing that later, Rebecca, through the platform. What this is, it's essentially takes the red list, and I like to think of it kind of like flattens it down and gives you a number, a score for a specific location. The red list is really informative, but it can be complex to use when you're trying to compare one location versus another. Where are my risks higher in this place versus this place? STAR really helps you quantify that. It gives you a number telling you extinction risk here is 20, extinction risk here is 5. So it makes it easily comparable. So that's a really helpful metric. Now, again, if we move into our, how can we kind of manage those risks and opportunities? So just kind of probably touched on this a little bit already. So understanding what are the habitat types that are there that are that the species require, and are any of these linked to your operations? By the way, all this data is available through the detailed red list. The threats we talked about, so understanding what threats are acting on species that are present, but then linking them to activities at your sites. So there are threats such as climate change that impact a lot of species, which you might not really be able to do anything about immediately. I mean, obviously collectively we should be, but it might not have that immediate impact. Or it might be things like, I don't know, hunting that your company perhaps can't really do much about. But then there might be threats such as pollution, or I don't know, illegal fishing that maybe you could affect. So really understanding what threats are acting on your species, and then linked to that are the conservation action, which can really help you determine what can I do as an organization to help protect species and reduce this threat of extinction and that site. And on that kind of those conservation actions, it's really considering, is there anything you can do directly as a company, or probably most likely partnering with the local NGO on that. And just to say, like, for helping species, generally some ground truthing is required before any action is taken. So just something to consider. And I've already covered the start point. So
great. Yeah, so I have an example risk as well for areas important for species. It took place in Canada. So there was a Canadian land clearing company, and they were subcontracted for a road construction project. And this site contained this New Jersey tea plant, which is the only plant on which this endangered mottled dusky winged butterfly lays its eggs, which I love. That's like the best butterfly name I think I've ever heard. And before they could clear, they had to remove the plants and move them to a different location to preserve the butterfly habitat. But before the permit was issued, basically the company cleared it and cleared these plants before everything was in place, and it destroyed a large area of protected butterfly habitat. And this resulted in criminal conviction of that company. This was last year. So the endangered species risk was there, and it was documented, but it didn't make it to what was happening on the ground. So threatened species, as Joanna mentioned, they do carry legal protections in most places, and these apply regardless of whether the company is aware of them or not. So proximity to known habitat of invasive species, that can be a source of legal and regulatory risk. And yeah, Joanna, could you tell us, so we've been talking about risks, but we did have some examples here. If maybe we could pick one and just talk about how an example of a company integrating this data into their actual nature strategy. I know you've touched on it a little bit with like the no-go, et cetera, but if there's anything else.
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk about this manufacturer of medical equipment. So, and they kind of they've used like all, these were IBAT clients that we had. So they've used all the 3 data sets together. So they thought they were doing really well on climate, and they wanted to get a head start on kind of their nature. So first did the kind of a strategy and roadmap. And what they did is they had 300 locations. They screened them all for proximity to KBAs and protected areas. So they understood where they were in proximity to those. And then they selected their most material sites. So these were their manufacturing locations. So most material in terms of an impact perspective. So perhaps maybe their offices, they would have lower impact than their manufacturing locations. So they selected those 30, there were 30 most material sites, and they identified which of those were within 1 kilometer of a protected area. And then what they did is they started to look at species and KBAs at those sites. And by the way, I wanted to add, actually, Rebecca, when you were talking about the KBAs and looking into the detail as to why something is a KBA, it's that species component is really important as well. So understanding if a KBA is designated a KBA because it includes some restricted range species or in the threatened species, you can then focus on those specifically and look at the threats and conservation actions that we've discussed. So they looked at, the KBA aspect and then the species at those locations. And then this company partnered with an environmental consultancy, and they developed a portfolio of actions to take based on the ecosystem types and the species at their sites. So I think they had, I can't remember the examples, or I do, but I won't go into them. They had a whole catalog of them, and it was quite amazing, actually. So they listed the main pressures on the species in that ecosystem, and then they cataloged kind of proposed responses for that pressure that the company could realistically take. So I think for butterflies, it may have been planting like wildflower meadows, but a whole variety of things they could do. And then what they did is they shared this portfolio of actions with their site managers to encourage action and provided support along the way. But it was that kind of looking at the broader picture, selecting those few most important sites for action. So not trying to, do everything all at once, really prioritizing, and then looking at tangible actions we could take at those locations was the thing that really was impactful. And now that they've kind of started on that road, they're going from 30 to what will the next set be? So I thought that was a really nice example.
Yeah, that's great. And that ties in also with really what our Dunya Analytics platform is designed for too. When you have many sites, how do you prioritize them, and then prioritize them in a way that you can understand how to take meaningful action from those sites? That's so great. Thanks for those examples. I'm going to touch on ecosystem integrity, which was the last category we're going to talk about. But I'll do this briefly because I want to be able to show you our platform. So ecosystem integrity has two aspects. There are high integrity ecosystems and then also areas of rapid decline. On the Dunya Analytics platform for high integrity ecosystems, we look at ecosystem intactness. And this is an example, actually both of these. Well, and maybe I'll talk about the risks together. So, and then for areas of rapid decline, we look at two aspects: forest loss and then also land degradation, so that we can cover all ecosystems, not only forests. So high integrity ecosystems, they provide the greatest number of ecosystem services to people and to companies. And just as an example, if your company relies on water supply for manufacturing, let's say, and you're located near a high integrity ecosystem, assuming you are drawing on groundwater locally, then that ecosystem that's intact is providing that reliable water source for you, also clean water for you. And if you're near an area that is in rapid decline, then that could affect that water source. So if an intact ecosystem starts to degrade, then it will be less, you will have a less reliable water source that can represent a physical risk to the company. Like what would happen if that water source disappeared? How would that affect your operations or your revenue? So if you're located near a high integrity ecosystem, in this case, that's a way, helping to keep that intact as a way to mitigate your risk. Both your dependence, but also the transition risks that can come with degraded land or like deforestation. That can be a big reputational risk. And I will say, when we just recently added areas of rapid decline to our platform, and one of the biggest aha moments we've had is that forest loss is happening almost everywhere. Like most sites, when we do the assessment, have some forest loss. And we can show where that decline is happening. It's also easy to connect the dots to who's responsible. So thinking about reputational risk, and it's easy to connect the dots because for most areas of the globe, it's pretty clear what the drivers of that forest loss are. So once these are visualized, it's very transparent. Where it's happening and why it's likely happening. So if you're not measuring this, but other people are looking at it, then that's another thing to think about from a risk perspective around reputation. So in terms of managing these risks, I mentioned this a little bit. in the example of the high ecosystem integrity, the water supply example. So first, to manage this risk is to first quantify the dependency. What would it cost to replace that water supply if the ecosystem degrades? Invest in ecosystem protection or restoration, not as philanthropy, but as infrastructure for your company. And then engaging with watershed governance, because there are of course other actors in the watershed, like other companies, municipalities, and they may be degrading the ecosystem even if your company is not. And then for areas of rapid decline, understanding the drivers of decline in that area, as I mentioned, and then assessing whether your operations or your supply chain are connected to any of those drivers to manage that risk. It's really important to monitor change over time. See, is this accelerating or is it happening closer to your sites? And then, of course, identifying restoration or mitigation commitments that you can make. I do have an example risk for areas of rapid decline that was tied to JBS, one of the world's largest meat processors. And their company was linked to deforestation in its supply chain. And they were made to pay millions in fines. And they lost investors and customers, but most of all, they had their IPO delayed because of this. So nature risk, when it's made visible like that, can have these really large implications. All right, I want to give a quick demo of our platform to show how we have embedded the IBAT data into our platform. And can you see our platform, or no? Are you still seeing the slides?
So the slides, yeah.
Still the slides, okay. All right, let me just share again. Now that this is up. There we go. Okay, so this, can you see it now? Yes, yeah. I can see, you can see it. So this is a wind farm that is located in Guadeloupe. This is just a demo site. And here you can see the three major aspects: community presence, biodiversity, and water stress. I should say there's a lot I could show you on the platform, but I'm just going to focus on the IBAT data and how it's been integrated in, and we would be more than happy to show you a demo of the full platform at a later time. So biodiversity here is flagged as risk, and we use orange to indicate risk. And on purpose, we don't use red, green, because there's never an area that for sure doesn't have nature risk or never will, because the nature data are always changing. As Joanna was talking about, new KBAs turn into protected areas, and it's very dynamic. So gray means that at this moment in time for this assessment, risk isn't indicated, but it should be, you should assess it regularly. But we do see biodiversity, so we can scroll down and see why this area is important for biodiversity. So we see there are a number of protected areas in this assessment area, and they have different IUCN categories, so different reasons why they're protected. There is a key biodiversity area here, and we do have a hyperlink, so you can go to the web page and see why it's a KBA. And then looking at areas important for species, here's the star metric that Joanna mentioned with this threshold here. So this is above that threshold. So this is indicated as an area that should be prioritized for looking at abating threats and for conservation. And then we provide a list of all of the threatened species that underlie that star score. So this is the IUCN Red List of threatened species. You can export the list of species so that you have that whole list, and you can export all of the results so that you can see it in one area comprehensively. So that's a tiny view into the platform. Let me go back to our slides and see if we're just about finished up with our content. I don't know if we have any questions or.
Yes.
Okay,
we
great.
have some questions in here. So maybe I can start with the first one submitted regarding KBAs. Is there publicly accessible free KBA data available?
I can take that. So you can look on the KBA website. It's all there and open, but for commercial use, you do need a license to use KBA data. So either through IBAT, Dunya Analytics, or another platform that provides IBAT data. And just to reiterate, this data is put together by scientists, by conservation organizations working on the ground, and the money you pay to access the data for your commercial use is fully reinvested back into that KBA data set. So if we didn't have the funding, we wouldn't have the data, and so it's really important that that cost recovery mechanism is there.
Thank you, Joanna. And we have another question about IBAT or Dunya. Going back to the palm oil case, where I think the oil palm plantation was in a protected area, how can IBAT data or Dunya Analytics be used to avoid this risk at the beginning? In other words, like, how are the data applied in the corporate decisioning that helps reduce that risk? And then by extension, if you're a bank, how can you avoid lending money to that type of organizations? Like, how can you uncover those risks?
Do you want me to take that, or do you want to, Rebecca?
Yeah, you can. Well, I can start, and then feel free to add if you'd like. And Megan, also, please feel free to add as well. So yeah, that's why it's really helpful in terms of the beginning, doing a screening of across all of the company locations or across a portfolio. If you're a financial institution, you can understand which sites prioritize, which ones have these greatest potential risks, and then it's going to be once you have that list of prioritized areas, it's not necessarily that just because they're located next to a KBA that it's risk. It really has to do with what activities are they doing and how are they engaged. So there's a point of engagement there, to engage with that company or engage with that site and see, like, is it actually a red flag? And then a lot of that is going to revolve around their governance, and how they are managing their own risks within their company or at that site. So I'd say the first step for avoiding this risk at the beginning is doing this assessment across the entire portfolio. And yeah, Joanna or Megan, please feel free to add anything else to that.
Yeah, I want to add, I think I want to acknowledge that there's also a challenge here before that first step you mentioned, and that's understanding where the locations are. So we know that for a lot of banks investing in certain companies, you might know where their head office is, but you might not know where their farms are. So really getting that understanding of the spatial location of where you're sourcing from, if it's in your supply chain or what you're investing in, is really important. And that we know that can be a challenge. But there are tools you can use for that, or having that relationship with your supplier and ensuring that they share the locations of where they're sourcing from with you, so that you can then do that screening through platforms like this is that step. But I do want to acknowledge that that's sometimes really challenging, and I think we're all trying to solve that problem, but it is still there. Yeah.
And there is an element of the location data being held confidentially by companies. Some of those are for legitimate reasons. The source is their competitive advantage. Others are for not so legitimate reasons because they may be doing poor behavior. How we work with our customers or advise them is to ask the supplier, if they're not willing to share those locations, at least to do their own risk assessment using an independent third party, so that you can identify as a buyer, you can identify, or an investor or lender, you can identify across your portfolio who cares about this, who's measuring it, who is operating good governance around it, and who is not, so that you know to engage with those who are not exercising good governance and try to encourage them to do so. And then similarly, those who do exercise good governance and are saying, yes, we've got risks in the supply chain, to engage with them on how those risks can be managed or reduced or mitigated. So the supply chain assessment, you don't necessarily need 100% full transparency on where all the locations are, if you can at least identify where your hotspots of concern are, because the next step anyway would be to engage the appropriate suppliers to help them transition how, or to align to a nature positive transition, I guess I would say.
Before, I know we have time for one more question, but I did want to launch one poll to see if you're interested in us reaching out to you. So let me start that, and then, yeah, feel free. We can go on to another question.
Yeah, there's a couple questions here. I think I'll answer one in the platform, but another one is around how do we quantify dependency? And Rebecca, you and I have spent a lot of time working with companies on that. We've talked about how to do dependency nature scenarios. We've talked about like how to think about how a physical nature risk might manifest. Do you want to discuss that a little bit? And then likewise, Joanna, if you want to share any insights on that.
Sure. So, first step in understanding what the dependencies are, we have that in our platform as well, and it uses the Encore data. So for your industry, you can see across, we look at both impacts and dependencies, 13 different impacts, 25 different dependencies on ecosystem services. So that's step one. That can give you a level of magnitude, like is this very low through very high dependency, for example, on water supply or on pollination or on water or on flood mitigation, for example. And then once again, you have those prioritized sites that show that the ones in sensitive areas that have the greatest impacts or dependencies, then you can look at that short list of prioritized sites and start engaging with what is actually happening on the ground. How much is this dependency an actual dependency versus potential? And then you can then calibrate that within our platform in order to reflect what's actually happening at the site. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there, and I don't know if Joanna, you want to add anything?
I think you covered it. Yeah, thanks.
Great.
Well, it doesn't look like there's any other questions that hasn't been answered manually or verbally, and we're just out of time. So maybe we can go ahead and wrap up this webinar. So thank you everybody for joining. As a reminder, we will be sharing the recording. If you would like to further explore how our platform can support your nature risk assessment, please reach out to us by replying to any of our emails or contacting us via our website. We hope this has been valuable. Thank you for your time and your questions, and we wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers. Bye-bye.